and microphone, and I'm going to pass it over to Evolve Security Engineer, Micah Johnson.
Cool. Thank you, Colleen. So yeah, everyone, happy to be speaking today. I'll go ahead and share my screen here. So 1 second. And then just to confirm, you should be able to see the password spraying PowerPoint presentation.
Yep, we see it.
Cool.
Looks good.
Yeah, so I'll start off. So hi, my name is Micah Johnson. And so I'll be covering password spraying today. That's kind of the topic at hand. So with that said, I'll just kind of jump into it. So the typical who I am slide. So Micah Johnson, as Colleen mentioned, I'm a security engineer with Evolve Security, primarily focused on web application pen testing and network-based pen testing, both internal and external testing. Prior to Evolved, I spent some time performing PCI security audits for organizations of various sizes. Most importantly, Dogfather of Maya, who you see there on the right. And then another shout out, as I was also the summer 2019 cohort of Evolve Academy. So highly recommend the Academy. So that's kind of who I am. So I'll kind of jump into the actual why I chose to really talk about password spraying. So really the first is just as kind of a real world scenario that came up on an engagement recently, performing some web application penetration testing, where we were able to gain access to user accounts through password spraying. And within password spraying, from a credentials perspective, we were able to identify a SQL injection vulnerability that was only apparent from an authenticated user standpoint, right? So you need to be authenticated application in order to access this kind of vulnerability, right? But once you had access, if you're able to identify the vulnerability, from there you'll be able to dump essentially the database of the web application, right? So essentially the heart of the web application, right? So this is kind of just a real world scenario. I thought this kind of depicts why password spraying is important, because it is kind of the entryway in the door and kind of allows an attacker a way in to kind of identify some information along the way. So some other reasons why I kind of chose this topic is that on essentially most penetration assessments, there is some form of password-based attacks that you can employ. It kind of comes down to the aspect of kind of importance and kind of aspect of research, how much time you have in engagement, but typically there's some sort of password-based attack vector in play with, you know, pen tests. So that being said, I think it's an area where I think personally, I think I wanted to get better at, because it's always going to be there. So might as well get better, might as well become more efficient in kind of methodology and kind of utilizing this attack vector. So that's kind of why I chose password spraying. That being said, I would say this is not an overly extensive study on password spraying. Primarily for this demonstration, we'll be focusing primarily on web apps. So hopefully, really the goal of this talk is to kind of spark some interest in kind of getting better with password spraying, and hopefully you pick up a couple of tricks and tips along the way that will help you better perform password spraying. So that's really what we're going after here with this talk. Then just kind of the baseline here. So just a quick overview of password spraying. So it's a it's a type of automated password-based attacks where attacker attempted to brute force the logins based on a list of usernames with default or weak passwords. So really the goal is gaining unauthorized access to an application or service. Yeah, so that's essentially, that's a pretty quick overview there, but a couple of different, with this next one, I'm gonna do differentiation here. Just kind of make sure we're on the same page. So sometimes password spraying and credential stuffing gets kind of intermingled or mangled as far as how they're described. So just for the sake of this conversation, I just wanted to kind of keep it baseline. So in this here, so with password spraying, the constant is the password, right? Or the password, right? So we're using the same password against many different user accounts. So that's the constant. The variable is the actual usernames, right? So it's just it's an attack where we're cycling through emails and usernames to try to find the weakest password or the weakest link in the bunch, right? So that's really what our goal is with password spraying. Whereas how that differs from credential stuffing, and to the right here, you see credential stuffing is where attempting to reuse credentials that are valid for one account or service for another. So like in this kind of example, this is coming from like probably data breach dump credentials, but essentially using valid credentials for, in this example, like Yahoo, using it for Gmail, trying to see if those credentials still work for Gmail, the bank account and what have you, see what access an attacker can use with the valid credentials, right? So that's just a quick differentiation, just so I thought it was important. But for the sake of the study, we'll be focused solely on kind of password spraying. So just wanted to kind of call it out there. And so next, so here's kind of the attack methodology I use for password spraying. So really, so this is it's important to have a methodology because you have to have some sort of framework to kind of work off of in order to kind of improve and become more efficient in your processes. So here's the methodology I use. So that being said, I mentioned we are focusing primarily on kind of web apps and testing web apps here, or password spraying in regards to web apps, but this methodology could be utilized across different services, right? So like if you're testing internal networks against SMB, Kerberos. So this is all stuff that this methodology can be utilized across various services, right? But for the sake of kind of the focus here is going to be web apps. So really the first step in this methodology is kind of gathering usernames. So password spraying is a game of numbers, right? So the more opportunities an attacker has to find a user with a weak password, the higher likelihood of success. So it works, and this works most efficiently when you have the ability to enumerate valid users, and you can identify, you can inspect the password policy, right? So there's kind of two pieces to the puzzle for the credentials, right? Valid user and valid credentials. So that's why we want to gather as many potential usernames that we have, and try to utilize the username enumeration vulnerability to like determine which accounts are valid or which are invalid. So first step of the process is gathering usernames. So we're going to start at a high level. So gathering usernames. This is Discover Scripts. So this is an open source intelligent tool. As far as it performs web reconnaissance and counter reconnaissance. So the harvester is part of Discover Scripts. So it's kind of in combined, they're in one, but there are separate tools. But so for this example, we'll be targeting this Contoso. It's a fake organization, so just want to call that out there first and foremost. It's a fake organization, so that's why if you see this contoso.org, you can see it from there. But yeah, so this is kind of, again, one data source for email addresses. The big thing with Discover Scripts is making sure that your API keys to the various services are valid and kind of connected to the tooling. So for instance, in order to get the most out of Discover and Harvester, you want to make sure your Shodan API keys, GitHub, Google, Hunter.io are all, your API keys are all configured into the toolings, because that way Discover and the Harvester utilize the API keys in order to extract the data from these appliance applications. So this is just one source, but if you move on, the next source is LinkedIn. So this is kind of a fun one, I think. What we're doing here is, again, this is that same organization. What we're doing is we're really after just the usernames, right? We're not necessarily after the emails at this point. We can always configure the emails according to whatever naming schema the organization has, but for the sake of, at this stage, we're really just after the name. So this is kind of an open source way to gather emails from LinkedIn, if you will. So what we're doing right now is we're scraping the usernames, and then we're putting in a list, and then from there, again, we can formulate the email address name schema according to what we determine to be the valid naming schema, right? So there are paid versions. I believe there's paid versions of like this LinkedIn, I think like Sales Navigator or something. But for the sake of being accessible to everyone, we just like to keep it open source. So this is kind of a cool way to just gather emails from LinkedIn, and then as well. So this is kind of like, okay, Nessus, right? But typically on an engagement, right, you're running some sort of network scanners, you're running some sort of application vulnerability scanner. So again, this is just another data source for emails, potential usernames, right? So just check the outputs, make sure you're gathering as many emails as you can. So just wanted to kind of call it out there as well. And then and also, so this is another way, this is another tool. So cool, typically it's typically how I've seen cool used before in the past has always been more like CTFs of essentially it's a Ruby app that will spider web pages and gather the words from the web pages. So typically it's used in like CTFs and whatnot. But another cool aspect I've came across was the ability to kind of pull emails from a web page. And so that's where you see this kind of syntax here. And so when this comes into play is that, you know, as you're kind of performing the OSINT and the recon with the organization, if you come across the company website, you know, the about us page, the staff directory, it's just a effective way to grab the emails from the web page. And so just kind of a cool tool I like to use. And again, it's one of those things that as you're doing the open source intelligence, you come across a page, you can just easily just grab the emails from it, which is kind of cool. And it does crawl a bunch of different, from a depth of 2 is standard. So you can, depending on the website, you can crawl different pages as well. So just thought that's a pretty cool tool as well. So I don't know if pun was intended, but yeah, that happened. And then I guess the next one is another kind of cool idea or a cool way to kind of go about it, right? So generate, like after you kind of exhausted your searching for emails and usernames, you can also just, if you have the ability to validate the users, like enumerate whether what users are valid, you could potentially just generate your own usernames and use the username enumeration vulnerability as a way to determine whether the names you generated were valid or not, right? So here's just one tool I like to use, or I came about. So it's email address mangler. So it's a PowerShell script. It's by Daft Hack. He has a lot of great tools on GitHub, so I'd highly recommend checking out his GitHub. He has like Mail Sniper, Domain Password Spray, a lot of great tools. So can't recommend checking out his stuff enough. Great tools. So again, as I mentioned, so in this screenshot, the assumptions we're making here is that we've already enumerated that the naming schema is first initial and last name. So here you see just the first initial and last name, and then the domain or the email address. So knowing that, then theoretically, what you could do is run an ABC list. ABC list is kind of what I call, but like running a listing of the first names that are A through Z against the top 50 last names. And then theoretically, you could gather a bunch of email or valid accounts from that, right? So that's essentially what we're doing here. If you kind of look at the command, it's an ABC list of letters A through Z as a first name. The last name is the top 50 last names. And then the address convention is using first initial last name and then the organization. So it's just a way to kind of generate usernames without, if you don't have any, right, at that point. So just kind of a creative, unique opportunity to kind of further add to your bucket of potential usernames, right? And so the next one is username anarchy. So this is kind of a very similar tool. It works well in a Linux or Unix based operating system. So it's a Ruby script. So it's very similar to email address mangler. Excuse me, but yeah. So I guess this is just kind of a different example. So in this scenario, we were able to identify a valid. We know a valid employee, right? But at this organization, but we don't necessarily know the naming schema of the organization, right? So I'll just quickly cover it. But again, this was just a way to kind of confirm. Again, so the assumption being made here is that you have an employee that you know is valid and you know the organization, but you don't necessarily know the naming schema. So right, and so this only works if you're able to enumerate valid users from some sort of like a web app authentication process, right? So that's why it's really crucial to have ability to confirm valid user accounts or not. So again, this is very similar to email address mangler, but just kind of a different tool utilized on easily utilized on Linux or Unix operating systems. So cool. So I'll go to the next one here. So again, second stage of kind of password spraying here is ability to enumerate valid users, right? So very critical. If you're not able to enumerate valid users and you don't have the password policy, then password spraying is probably not the most efficient attack path, right? So because otherwise you're kind of flying in the dark, and you don't necessarily have an ability to identify good responses from bad responses, if you will. And then the caveat here too is typically on like typically if you can identify where authentication happens on a web app, you can most likely determine some sort of user enumeration from the response. The caveat here is that's not 100%, but typically if there's some sort of authentication going on with the web application, usually you can determine some validity of the user accounts. Again, not 100% of the time, but it's definitely a good place to start if you're trying to enumerate users. So yeah, here we just see, this is just kind of a classic web app authentication process where you get very clear responses between when you're submitting an invalid account, you just get a very clearly WordPress invalid user. So from there you can rule out that username. And then on the right, administrator, right, that's just the classic WordPress account. So from there it gives this one so nicely provides a verbose message where it clearly just tells you it's the password that's wrong. So really identifying the different responses between invalid accounts and valid accounts is crucial, because once you've able to identify the differences in responses, you can take that and kind of automate that process. Again, we won't focus too much on WordPress here because there is essentially a whole nother conversation that to be had about WordPress attack paths, username enumeration, brute forcing with WordPress. So we'll just kind of leave WordPress as is. So I guess how an application should respond here is that it shouldn't give an indication of whether the account is valid or not, right? It should say something to the fact like credentials provider invalid, and not give some sort of indication of whether it's the email or whether it's the password that are invalid, right? So just having that kind of standard generic response that doesn't give any sort of indication of which one you have wrong as an attacker. So here essentially what we did is this is just automating the process we saw in the slide before. So now that we have identified what a good response looks like and what a bad response looks like, we can automate that process and utilize the listings of we gathered thus far. And so what we have here is then here's just kind of here's the response in burp proxy. This is an intruder attack. So what we're able to do there is kind of sort up depending upon the responses we're expecting to see back for valid accounts. So once we have there, we can start to create a new list of the listing of all the valid accounts, and then that listing we'll start to use from now on, right? So it's just kind of getting to that process where we can gather as many valid accounts as possible, and that's only because we started with a bigger pool of just potential usernames at that point. And so then the next one is, so here's another like a web app password response. So on the left, you see here that, when you submit an invalid account, it clearly says unknown email address. So you can rule out, well, the email address we sent was apparently not a user. So if you're able to determine a valid user, you get kind of a success response message from the password reset. I would proceed with caution with this one. It's typically with password resets, you can get some sort of username enumeration, but you could also kind of burn your accounts if you have them, or potentially reset accounts of valid client users, right? Users of your clients that use the application, right? So you got to kind of proceed with caution with this, but there may be some sort of indication whether email accounts are valid or not. And then if you can kind of rule out depending on the validity of the account, you could also look to perform potentially brute force, but again, being conscientious of resetting your users of your client. So that's typically not the best way to go, but how this should respond is that how an application should, or how the server should respond with these messages that summon to the fact of, we sent if this account exists, we sent a reset link to your email, you used to register, some to that sense, right? It's kind of a too obtuse language as like a user, right? But that's you kind of need to be that way in order to not allow kind of this ability to enumerate users, right? Again, keeping the standard same responses for successes and failures. I guess another just caveat as far as enumerated value users, APIs can be a very good route to go down for as far as determining the validity of accounts. So just kind of more food for thought there for web apps. And then and as well as OWA. OWA is kind of my favorite because it's a really cool attack path, and there's a lot of documentation around attacking OWA. So in this instance, so we're looking at is Outlook web app, Outlook WebEx, whichever one you use. But it's a web email client. So the cool thing with this, the cool thing with OWA is that the username enumeration vulnerability isn't necessarily in the messaging of the server. It's in the time. It's a timing based vulnerability where here you can see that here's a valid use. It says failed login, but username is valid. So it was a failed login, but you still enumerate a valid user. So I should caveat this tool we're using is Metasploit. So here's just kind of the OWA login in Metasploit. I like it because it kind of very clearly shows how it's able to determine the validity of account, right? So this response alone, like if you go into a web browser and try to log in and you see just authentication failed, no sort of indication, but then how you're able to leverage this, again, it's timing based. So it takes longer for the server to determine that the account is invalid than it does a valid, right? So for a valid account, it responds back in 0.219, I think that's seconds. For invalid accounts, it's right around 3. So again, looking at these responses individually, you can't really determine that, but once you kind of put them together, you're able to identify really the one that sticks out, the one that doesn't go well with the others. That's kind of how you determine whether accounts are bad. So this is just really a cool response. Again, there's a lot of good resources out there for RBA, but just wanted to go over that one because that's always a cool example. And then really the second piece of the puzzle, right? Passwords. So we worked all this time to kind of enumerate valid users. We still got to worry about passwords. So that's really the second piece of the puzzle, the passwords. So that's when it comes very crucial to inspect the password policy. So like be able to inspect the password policy, you're able to kind of create certain passwords that would comply with the password policy, but still be considered weak, right? Kind of the workaround, right? And so this is kind of a cool tweet. I like this tweet because it's IPSec is kind of when I was diving deeper into OWA and password spraying, but it's just kind of he was kind of tweeting an engagement as he's going along. I'd be very careful about that as far as kind of disclosing sensitive information, but it's just kind of cool to see his thought process and kind of go through it. But really, when we're kind of thinking about password policies, really the goal is to not lock out accounts, right? That's locking out accounts. No one likes it. It's not good for the client. It's not good for the security professional, like not good for the user, right? So it's not good. So being very cognizant of not locking out accounts is crucial for password spraying. So yeah, it's always if you have ability to check out a lockout policy, check it out. But if not, you need to kind of do some manual enumeration with the user and just being very careful of lockouts. Just kind of a quick rule of thumb for OWA is, typically it's like minimum 4 login attempts before account logouts. So how I've kind of gone about is 2 password spraying attempts for 30 minutes. The caveat there is that's not, it's dependent on the application, right? And the password policy and the password, the lockout policy, right? A former colleague of mine mentioned their default policy was 1 attempt per every 61 minutes. So again, depending on the appetite, depending on the organization, it varies. Also, this is a conversation to be had with the client, depending on, if they want to pursue password spraying, just kind of letting the client know beforehand, before being proactive and letting the client know that here's a attack avenue we find, we're going to do some password spraying, and just kind of being very upfront with it. And then, if you happen to lock out an account, notify the client as soon as possible. It's always much better to be proactive in the situation where, as a security engineer, if you mess up, notify the client as much as possible. Be proactive. Don't have them call you and say something goes wrong. So that's just kind of advice I have there, because it's always much better being proactive and kind of being reaching out before you get the call from them. And so here, here's just kind of looking at the password policy again. For web apps, if you're able to register your account, that's like a gold mine, because it just gives you an insider view of what a typical user has to go through to create a password. So again, here you see in the bottom just some sort of passwords that came about from kind of looking at the password policy. But one thing I like doing on for password spraying is utilizing password one, winter season, and then I like using what I've been getting success with lately is using the name of the application as a password, right? So in this application, this is OWASP JuShop. So using JuShop1, some variation of that is what I've seen is kind of a cool approach, or like it's a way to kind of skirt around not having password and not having season, but still kind of utilize the application and be a little more customized. Yeah, and so then the other part is after we've kind of inspecting the password policy, now we have to formulate some sort of list passwords based upon kind of the research we gathered from the password policy. So this is just one tool, weak password generator, where for me, it's like it's much easier to delete stuff than actually come across with trying to formulate this. So this is just a quick tool that it generates quick win passwords depending on the season. So this is run in March. It's gonna make some assumptions as far as password policy, like a 4-month password policy. So it's gonna date back a couple of months depending on when you run it. But it's just kind of a cool tool to use to formulate some sort of list when you don't necessarily have a list. So I like to use it and just kind of like a baseline, kind of from there deviate a little bit. Again, so I think my favorite is like the custom word list, right? So again, still targeting that same organization, but utilizing company name, application name. A colleague of mine mentioned he starts using street addresses and cities, which I think is a very cool technique. And then as well as a kind of standard password, month, season, and holiday. That's where you kind of see here on the left. And then we're just adding different. You could also iterate from there and add different years depending on the year. So if there's some sort of number-based requirement, having some sort of year or a number associated with it. Another caveat is you could take this listing and run it against, use it hashcat to run it against a best list, a best 64 list. It's just kind of an example, but essentially it's going to iterate through different versions of the word, running one word through different versions, like using, if you look at this example, using, changing O to zeros and just kind of different ways to iterate through the process. So definitely a cool thing to check out, but you could start swimming in password, potential passwords at this point. So do want to kind of wanted to halt it there. And then the last one, at least, but automated spraying attacks, right? So this is essentially this is a lot of trial and error and a lot of kind of going through, and yeah, it takes some work to definitely get a successful password spray. But after all the kind of work we've done thus far, you kind of have you want to think you have a better opportunity, a better chance of success with these. And so that's when, I mean, this is just the standard web app password spraying, using burp intruder to automate this process. I would caveat again, be very cognizant of account lockouts, because it gets, once you start password spraying, if you don't get an error or something kind of blatantly error, it's kind of hard to determine whether your spraying is actually doing anything or not. And so that's just a word of warning, as far as I've had the situation where we've locked some accounts out, and it's it's, yeah, sometimes you get lost in actually spraying. So definitely word of warning. But in this, I mean, in this example, you see, we're just, again, here's just the request we're making for an authentication to his web app. What we're doing is we're taking this request, and again, this instance is I'm using the application, the name of the application plus one and exclamation mark as some sort of like a password, right, to comply with the password policy. And then I'm just iterating through the username. So focusing on the usernames that may potentially have this password. So, and in this instance, you can see, you can start to sort the responses based upon, what a successful response looks like. And sometimes you don't know what that is, right? As far as like, if you don't have credentialed access to the application, you're not going to know what that, but you have to kind of sift through the responses and see what a good response looks like. And sometimes it's as simple as, like, you see, these are the responses, and the length of the responses to how long it is, right? It may be as simple as it's a lot longer responses, and that indicates that it's a successful authentication process, right? So be very cognizant. There was password spraying attempts where I had to double check it. I didn't see it at first, and then I came back and essentially that was right. Those are correct credentials. So being very cognizant of the responses is crucial. Then just kind of a pro tip with, if you're doing burp intruder, sometimes if everyone does use burp proxy or burp intruder, sometimes in this example, like this is if you have this is a very big list you're iterating through. So if you happen to notice something during the burp intruder attack that you just kind of want to pause it, there's not a great way to do it in burp. So kind of my workaround here is just clearing the payloads, right? So you're in burp intruder, you're going through an automated attack, and you notice something wrong and you just want to pause it, but you don't want to lose the results, right? Just a quick way is going into the payloads and just clearing the payloads, right? And that's just kind of the workaround. So I wanted to throw that in there because we were talking about password spraying, and this kind of the tip I came across with needing to stop it, but still needing the results. And then really the last one is for OWA. This is just another cool OWA tool. There's a lot of resources out there, but this is just another quick tool. It's called Spraying Toolkit, and so it's a Python script. Again, this one tool, it iterates it through really quickly, and so I think sometimes when these tools run super, especially for password spraying, when the tools run very quickly, sometimes it gets tricky to as far as not just keep doing it, right? So like, oh, let's just change the password. So that's when you kind of get in the situations where then you get a little sticky situation with account lockout. So can't stress or caution enough, watch out for account lockouts because they do happen. But this is another cool tool for OWA, and it iterates through the listing fairly quickly. So that I'm sure we're probably over time. And so next, everyone's kind of what everyone was waiting for is remediations. So here's just some of the remediations. Just essentially comes down to a strong password policy. So a quick this CIS password policy guide is kind of a good resources I use because it really breaks down kind of password policy. So here's the password policy they recommend is 8-character minimum password, dependent on if that account has MFA. If it has MFA, it could be 8 characters. If it doesn't have MFA, it needs to be like 14, right? So for a password only account, require one alphabetic character used and expires annually, as well as ensuring that there are account lockouts. It says OWASP recommend CAPTCHA, but if the lockouts are not viable, the caveat with CAPTCHA, or I've bypassed CAPTCHA in the past depending on the implementation. So it's not a trust, it's not totally reliable as far as CAPTCHA, but it is possible to sometimes bypass CAPTCHA depending on the implementation. And then always and forever multi-factor authentication. And then as far from a user's perspective, utilizing a password manager. I can't harp on how those last two enough because they're very important. And then
And then that essentially wraps it up. So here's kind of the resources. I kind of went through. I don't think this is not the extensive list, but these are some of the resources I went over in the PowerPoint. And then yeah, so that's essentially it for my presentation. Big thank you. Can't thank the all the security professionals who built and shared the tools that I went over today. Literally without them and countless other security professionals sharing their knowledge, research, and kind of advice, I wouldn't be here as a security professional. So can't thank the security community enough for sharing the knowledge and kind of being open to knowledge share. So that's Colleen, that's all I have for the presentation. So
yeah. Thanks so much, Micah. So we actually had a bunch of questions come in, but they were all answered during that last slide, that remediation slide. So really, really great job. I like the point that you said about knowledge sharing. I mean, the cybersecurity industry really relies on that. So we really appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise with us and creating this presentation. And I do have to say, I think Maya has a new fan club after this presentation. So I'm
nice.
sure people want to see more of her as as time goes on. But yeah, thank you again. And I want to thank everyone for coming today. We really appreciate it. You guys had great questions and great participation. A recording of this event will be available this afternoon, both on our website and via email. If you are looking for security services, please don't hesitate to reach out. You'll be directed to a feedback form after this. So fill out any information there if you want to get in touch. And don't forget to apply for our cyber training. And our application is still open for our next cybersecurity bootcamp beginning on April 25th. Other than that, thanks again, Micah and everyone, and have a great rest of your day. Bye, everyone.